Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ryan Guthrie. I'm the Vice President of Solutions Engineering here at ATS, and I appreciate everybody joining our webinar today on CAF performance testing. Before we get started, I'm going to put everybody on mute. Towards the end of the webinar, I'll open up your microphones so you can ask questions, or you can ask questions through our chat box as well. So what are we going to cover today? So here we are, January 19th. And CAF pre-testing deadline is now, so you can see the little countdown clock at the bottom there is at 0. It's time to get the pre-testing started. So today we're going to cover a little bit about ATS, give you some of our background, how we got involved in CAF performance testing, an overview of the testing process as far as what you have to do to be compliant, what kind of tests you have to run, how many subscribers, all those kinds of things, what your testing options are in order to be compliant, and then a little review of our solution, which carriers have been using for the past year or so to be compliant with their CAF testing. And finally, we do a little Q&A at the end. So just a quick background about ATS. ATS has been around since 1995, so coming up on our 26th anniversary this year. We're headquartered in northern New Jersey, but we have some satellite offices in Tennessee, North Carolina, and elsewhere. We've done just about everything in telecom broadband space over those years, from network analytics and testing to data analytics, and obviously a lot of regulatory work around things like USAC traffic studies, inter-carrier compensation, as well as this CAF performance testing. So what we're going to cover today is going to do a quick review of the program itself, who has to comply with the pre-testing requirements, when those dates start, how many you have to test, all that kind of stuff. So I assume most of the folks on the call today are someone in that program in the first box there, either ACAM2 or Legacy, CAF2, or New York Broadband. So as I mentioned, pre-testing starts now. So it started January 1st, 2022. So you need to have something in place so that you can do your first quarter of testing by the end of March. The pre-test results are due by the first week at the end of each quarter. So this first quarter's testing results will have to be submitted to USAC by the first week of April. And then the official testing doesn't start until next January. And the results for those tests aren't actually due for about a year and a half after that. I'm not sure why there's such a delay like that, but your next year testing, even though it starts January 1st, you don't actually have to submit those results until July of 2024. Now that's assuming everybody is compliant along the way. So if your pre-testing is not compliant, or if you don't submit your results at all, which shows that you're not compliant, then that changes how often you have to report, and you'll have to actually submit your results quarterly, even next year as well. But assuming everything maintains compliancy, you won't have to submit those results until July of 2024. So we're going to get a little more into what the difference is between that pre-testing and official testing, how many subscribers you'll need to test, what exactly you'll have to do, and how to get your testing platform set up. So first, what's the difference between pre-testing and official testing? So pre-testing is actually something that the FCC set up, that they added to the order way after it started. So to me, this is a very smart thing that they did. So when the order first came out, and I believe it was 2019, there was no such thing as pre-testing. Everybody was just supposed to jump right into the official testing, which would count towards you. So they added this pre-testing period, which, like I said, is actually a great idea because it gives everybody a full year to make sure that your network is performing as it should, and that you will be compliant when the real testing starts. So during that pre-testing period, there is no penalty if your tests are not compliant. You won't lose any of your funding. It's really just kind of a warm-up for you to make sure that everything is set, all your testing network is in place, and that the areas you're going to test are compliant before it really does count. And then when official testing starts next year, then everything does count. So starting January next year, if your tests at the end of the quarters are not compliant, then there are withholdings of your funding. And we'll go through a little more detail on that in a few minutes. So what actually are the testing requirements? So there's 1 week of testing required per quarter. Okay, and then that 1 week of testing is 7 days, so weekends, weekdays. All tests have to be performed between the hours of 6 p.m. and midnight. So they're trying to get that, more of your typical busy hour. So 6 p.m. to midnight, weekdays, weekends. During those 6 hours, it's 1 download and 1 upload test per hour. So 6 down and 6 up. And then for the latency testing requirements, it's actually 1 test per minute across those 6 hours. So quite a bit of latency testing to run. All those tests have to either terminate at or pass through an IXP. Now, this is something that got changed a little bit over time as well. So when the order first came out in 2019, FCC had a very specific list of about 15 locations where they said, this is an IXP location where your test has to either terminate to or pass through. And there was a lot of pushback on that because it was very specific and was posing a bit of a challenge to a lot of the providers, as well as some of the vendors who had to perform the testing for the carriers. If you're not familiar with what an IXP is, it's essentially a networking hotel where multiple carriers will house their equipment in one location, or to make things easier to kind of pass that traffic back and forth to each other. But those are typically main hubs where if your customer is going to Netflix or any other kind of popular site or service, they're most likely passing through one of these major IXPs. So it's a good way of testing that it's a real world type of a test and that the carrier isn't sort of cheating in a way by saying, okay, I'm going to run my test to a server that's right inside my network, so I know my customer is going to get good service, and not really test what happens more real world when they leave my network. So that's really why they put this IXP requirement in. But what changed was, because of that pushback, they said, okay, you don't have to terminate to one of these 15 IXPs. It just has to terminate or pass through some major IXP in the country. So that really opened things up and provided a lot more terminating locations to run your test to. And the last thing I'll mention is this COVID waiver. So last year they had a COVID waiver in place for the pre-testers who were last year, so that you only actually had to test 70% of your locations that you're really supposed to test. So if you were supposed to test 100 locations, you were only required to test 70 of those 100 through last year. And they've extended that waiver through the first 2 quarters of 2022. So who knows, that could be expanded beyond that, but for at least the first 2 quarters, you only have to test 70% of those locations. So how many locations do you actually have to test? So that depends a lot on what tiers you offer and how many subscribers that you have in those CAF supported tiers. So you can see the chart on the right there. If you have over 500 subscribers per speed tier per state, you have to test 50 of those customers. So it maxes out at 50. If you're between 51 and 500 subscribers, you have to test 10% of those subscribers. And if you have 50 or fewer, then your minimum is 5. And again, that's by speed tier by state. So if you got funding for tier 3 and tier 4 in your state, then you'll have to choose that many customers, or have to test that many customers on that speed tier per this table here. So you're probably familiar with this already, but the performance measures module in the hub is where you'll upload all of your subscriber information, and then you'll get that random sample back from USAC to say, okay, here are the locations you actually have to run your test from. So at first, some folks thought that, hey, we'll be able to pick our own locations, even though they're random. But USAC said, no, when you upload your data into the hub, we will spit out a list of random locations and give those to you. And those are the locations that you actually have to test. And then also in the performance measures module, when you upload your data results at the end of the testing, that's where you'll find out your compliance percentages by tier. So most importantly, how do you become compliant with your testing? So every speed tier requires that 80% of your tests have a calculated speed greater than or equal to 80% of your obligated speed. So if you are tier 3 and your obligated speed is 10 down and 1 up, 80% of your speed tests have to be greater than or equal to 8 megabits per second across that testing period. Same thing on the upload side. If it's 1, if it's 10.1, all your upload tests have to be greater than 0.8 megabits per second. When it comes to latency testing, 95% of your latency tests have to have an average round trip time less than 100 milliseconds. And just a note on that, if your subscriber is paying for 25.3 speeds, or you're required to test 25.3 speeds, that's your speed tier, but they're actually provisioned at 5010, then meeting that requirement shouldn't really be a problem for you. But if the opposite is true, and you're required to test tier 4 25.3 at a location, but that subscriber is only paying for, say, 10.1 speed, you'll actually have to upgrade that subscriber to 25.3 in order to test it at the speed required from USAC. So after you upload all your results to the PMM, this is what you'll get back from USAC, which essentially says this speed tier had these number of tests compliant, these number of tests non-compliant, and here's your compliance percentage. So you can see those top 3 rows there. 100% of the tests were compliant, 0 were non-compliant, so your compliance percentage is 100%. But those 3 rows in the middle can be a little confusing. So you see that you had 180 tests that were compliant, 5 that were non-compliant, but your compliance percentage is still 100%. So you might say, why is that? So I'll show you how they actually do the calculation here on the next slide. So we won't get too deep into the numbers here. It can get confusing, but this is just to explain why your percentage looks like 100% full compliant, even though you had some tests that failed. So they calculate your percentage here by taking the number that passes, adding the number that failed, dividing by the total number, and then dividing by 80% there. So you can see that based on these numbers, the compliance would be 119%, which of course gets capped at only 100%. So that's why in the previous slide you saw 100% full compliance. In other words, because you met the 80-80 rule of testing, you are 100% compliant. And like we talked about earlier, if you are not compliant, there are some real penalties here. So fully compliant, you can report. Don't have to do it quarterly when it comes to the real testing. You can just do it at that 1.5 year mark and submit your results. And obviously no withheld funding for that. But as soon as you get into level 1 of non-compliance, you will have to start reporting your results quarterly rather than at the end of the year. And they'll start to withhold some funding at 5% there. And as you go farther down the list there, you get more and more funding withheld and that quarterly reporting. And of course, they'll be keeping a closer eye on your results. So obviously, want to do everything you can to stay in that full compliance row. So let's talk about the different options you have as far as testing solutions. So the first one is the Measuring Broadband America program, which FCC has partnered up with Sam Knows. That program's been going for a number of years, and that's something you're able to participate in with them. To be honest, I haven't heard of any, or at least I haven't spoken to any carriers who have participated in that. I've heard it can be a little bit cost prohibitive, but certainly an option for you. The next option is to use some type of existing network tools or a third-party vendor, such as ourselves, that have a solution that you can deploy across the network. And then, of course, finally, is you can develop your own tools. So if you have routers that are capable that you can talk to with an ACS, and you can configure some type of testing network, pick testing servers, and do all that yourselves, then certainly an option to build an in-house solution to do your testing. So let's walk through our CAF solution, which uses something we call Stamper Boxes. So these Stamper Boxes are small IoT edge devices. They're very quiet, they're fanless, they're only about 3 inches by 3 inches, and they're very much just plug and play. So they just require you bring them to the consumer's house, you plug them into an RJ45 and give them power, and they go. So They talk to us all the time. They let us know if they're online. They let us know if a customer, kicked the plug out and they went offline for some reason. But they're very much just plug and play devices. Sort of high level, here's how the Stamper network testing platform works. So you'll put that Stamper box in the subscriber's home, connect it to their home modem or router, very much just like you would plug in any other kind of PC to the home there. And then once those devices are plugged in and they come online, they talk to us all the time. So we're able to see when it's online, if it's offline, again, and when it's online, it checks in with us all the time to see, do I have any jobs to run? Do I have to run any tests right now? And we send out that schedule. It says, okay, go download this file from this location and record the results. And then after you finish the test, upload the results back to our portal where we store them all and present them to you so you can access and see how your tests are going. And then also reformat them in the USAC required format for you to upload back into that PMM at the end of the week's testing. So our national test network is set up, it's a CDN supported network. If you're familiar with content delivery networks, essentially what that means is that our network chooses the fastest location to perform that test from at the time the test is run. So it's a really smart way to pick that test location, and it meets the USAC standards of going through or at a major IXP. This is one of the things you'll see when you log into our GUIs. You'll be able to check and see where your boxes are located, and they'll be color-coded to see how they've been performing across their tests. This is another chart you'll see in our GUI where you'll be able to log in and see what devices are online or not. So you can see those little green boxes on the right indicate that the boxes are online. So this happens all the time, right? Customers either unplug it for some reason or do it by mistake, and that box is offline. So before we actually schedule your week of testing, we'll work with you to say, okay, these 20 boxes are online. These 2 have gone offline for some reason. Can you reach out to this customer and try to get the box online before we do the testing? And then other things you'll be able to see in here include upcoming tasks, what tests were recently completed, and the results of those tests. And then once we're running these types of tests, right, there's a lot more information you can tell about how your network is performing, not just for the specific CAF test, but really generally. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things, the reason that the FCC included those major IXPs as locations that you have to test to was to make sure that you're testing who you hand the traffic off to and that they're performing well, right? So you're making good choices of who you're handing that traffic off to. And we found some interesting things working with carriers over the past year or so when it comes to where that traffic gets handed off to. So we found, for example, that when we went to one of our test points, this specific customer was, this specific carrier was handing the traffic off to, call it carrier A, and that was performing very well. And sometimes when we went to a different test point, it was handing that traffic off to carrier B, and they were not performing well. So even though we could run those tests within a few minutes of each other, one going to one test point, one going to the other, one would have very good results and one would have very poor results. And by taking a little deeper look at the routing of what was happening there, we were able to work with that provider and help them improve the next hop of who they were handing their traffic off to. And then at the end of the testing period, this is the format of the results that we'll give you. So it'll come down to you an Excel file, and this is what you'd actually upload into the hub. And USAC is very specific about this format down to how many decimal points there are and capital and lowercase letters, which we learned early on in this, so we have it down to a science now. But we'll provide this data to you, and this is exactly what you'll be able to upload into the hub and then get that results table back to them to show how compliant you are. So let's do a quick review. Pre-testing starts this quarter, right? We're in January now. you need to have something in place pretty quickly so that you have time to actually deploy it to your subscriber locations and do 1 week of testing before the end of March. 1 week of testing per quarter. Those tests have to run between 6 p.m. and midnight, with 1 download and 1 upload test happening per hour and 1 latency test every minute. Those pre-testing results are due within the first week at the end of the quarter. Again, so at the end of this first quarter here, you'll have to submit those results to USAC by the first week of April. In order to be compliant, there is the 80-80 rule. So 80% of the speed tests that run have to be greater than or equal to 80% of that speed obligation. And 95% of latency tests have to have less than or equal to 100 milliseconds of round trip time. We talked about those 3 options for testing, right? Whether you want to be in the MBA program, use an outside vendor such as ourselves, or build something in-house to address this. And then official testing for everybody will begin next year, January 1st, 2023, with those test results due July 2024. So I'll open up the mics and open up the chat window. If anybody has any questions, you can submit that through the chat window, or you can open up your microphone and ask it. So the first question is, how long can I use these locations for the testing? So the FCC is allowed for the same locations to be used for 2 years. So you don't have to move them around each quarter or even each year. You can use those same test locations for 2 years. And that first year of pre-testing counts towards the 2 years. So you'll have 1 year of pre-testing at these locations plus 1 year of actual testing. And then USAC will give you another list of random subscribers that you'll have to test for the following 2 years. Someone asked, when during the quarter do you run your tests? So it's not really a set time. It could be any time during the quarter, so we could do it the first week of January or the last week of March. Obviously, we don't like to do it right at the end like that, just in case something goes wrong. We like to allow a little bit of time to make any adjustments that need to be made. So we typically try to run them in the middle of the quarter, but we work with you to see if you're making any adjustments to your network. We can wait until that's done, or if there's any boxes that are offline and you have to work with those subscribers to get them back online. We work with you to make sure that the tests are run when everybody's ready. Someone asked about the size of the stamper boxes. So they're very small. They're only about 3 inches by 3 inches length and width, and then a little over 1 inch in depth. That looks like all the questions we're getting for today. So appreciate everybody joining, spending your time with us this afternoon. If you have any other questions, you can certainly go to our website. We have a lot of information on there, or you can reach out to myself or John Sarkis, who's on the team here as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. We'll look forward to talking to you soon.